What is going on, everybody? Tukey from Tukey Trading here. Hope everybody is doing well. For today's video, I want to be covering how exactly you can determine which supply and demand zones are best for you to trade, or ultimately which zones you should have the most confidence in terms of those zones actually working out, whether it's a supply zone or whether it is a demand zone. Now, if you don't know who I am, like I said, my name is Tukey. I've been trading for 5 years, since around 2021, and I've helped literally hundreds of traders get their starts within the markets. Now, if you are not familiar with trading with supply and demand, with drawing out supply and demand zones, I have a ton of different videos that you guys can check out that I highly recommend if you aren't familiar with this, because it will help you a lot in terms of understanding everything that I'm about to go over. So let's go ahead and hop on to the charts and make some magic happen. I will also be linking those other supply and demand videos that you guys can check out in the description below. So one of the main things that I want to start with is, and we actually have a perfect example right here, is looking for a certain rejection or hold within our specific zone that we are trading. Now, as we can see here, we have a pretty strong move to the downside. Now, instead of price continuing lower and breaking through this zone, you can actually see here that price started to hold within our zone and reject within that zone. Now, what that means is the opposite side of orders. In this case scenario, we had a ton of selling orders being inputted, caused by this big move to the downside. So once we got into our buying level, aka our demand zone, that's why we started to see signs of rejection, signs of price starting to hold within that zone, because instead of those selling orders, we then had those buyers starting to step in, those buy orders starting to be inputted. Like in the last videos that I mentioned, think of the market as a scale, right? We have our buy orders and we have our sell orders. When there are more buy orders being inputted than sell orders, price is going to continue higher. Vice versa, when there are more sell orders, like in this case scenario, more sell orders being inputted than buy orders, price will be moving to the downside. Now, in this case scenario here, the scale pretty much, instead of more sell orders being inputted, it kind of started to even out and balance out. Hence the reason for this rejection, for price starting to hold inside of our buying area. Now, obviously, pretty much the next candle, we then started seeing more signs of buying, more signs of rejection, which ultimately would just give us more confidence in that position, whether that's looking for our certain zone to, just work out, for us to get a better idea of where price is going to go, or for us to get a better understanding of where we can actually enter, right? Most of the time, we're using our supply and demand zones for two main reasons. A, to obviously get a better entry on the charts, and B, to see where price is ultimately going to lead to, whether that's getting a rejection to the upside or rejection to the downside. So that's one of the biggest things that you want to look for. And as you can see, pretty much every time that price had tapped into our demand zone, you can see price starts holding inside of this zone very well. Price starts holding inside of this zone very well. I believe there's another example here. Boom, demand zone. Once price taps into our demand, price holding inside of the zone very well, starting to show signs of rejection, meaning those buyers are starting to step in. The scale, instead of more selling orders, we're starting to get more buying orders, pushing that scale up, ultimately meaning price is going to start to be pushing to the upside. So pretty much every time you can see here, price is holding very well inside of that demand zone, which is a key confirmation that you want to look for in terms of understanding whether that zone is actually valid or not. If that zone was not valid, price would just simply move into the zone and continue lower and break lower, right? But in this case scenario and the multiple examples that we had covered, that was not the case. Price held inside of that zone, meaning the opposite side of orders were starting to be inputted. And that's exactly what we want to look for in terms of understanding, is our zone valid or not, right? Because if we start to see those opposite side of orders being inputted, that's telling us, okay, this zone is more than likely to be valid, meaning it will give us more confidence in terms of taking our entry or taking the trade, right? So back to the zone over here. Now, a repeating pattern that you will also see when it comes to our specific supply and demand zone rejections is you'll get a strong rejection wick. And what that will look like is something exactly like this. Pretty much where we're getting price tapping into the zone, and price or that candle rejects that zone heavily, which will look like pretty much all the examples we covered. We get that wick, and then we get the candlestick body starting to show signs of rejection to the upside. Now again, that's an amazing confirmation that we want to look for, because it's telling us that those buy orders, once price does tap into our buying zone, those buying orders are being inputted, right? If the zone wasn't valid, instead of getting that rejection candle, instead of getting signs of price holding, like I mentioned, price would just continue lower. It wouldn't even hold. It wouldn't even show signs of rejection, right? And I'll show you guys an example of that shortly later, but that is one of the biggest things that you want to look for. So, like I said, for this one, really looking for a change of direction within price. So, as we can see, we had a strong move to the downside. Why didn't that strong move continue, right? Because price tapped into our buying zone, aka our demand, and those orders started to be inputted, which is a good confirmation that our zone is likely to be valid. If, like I said earlier, price does break that zone and continue lower, that means that the opposite side of orders, meaning those buying orders, never really stepped in. Also meaning that that zone is likely to not be valid, okay? And keep in mind, exact same concept for supply zones, right? If price taps into our supply zone and price does not reject that zone back to the downside, or it doesn't start to show signs of any sort of selling pressure, it just continues higher above our supply, that means that that zone is not valid. Therefore, we don't really want to look to trade it or look at it anymore. So that's one of the biggest things. Now, also, we want to be understanding what price action is doing inside of our zones. Now, this is very similar to what we just went over in terms of looking at the wicks of the candles. Keep in mind, these candles are not just moving up and down for nothing, right? We're not just getting green and red candles all day for nothing. Think of the candles, think of the charts as if it's telling us some sort of story. And we have to use those clues to understand what's going to happen within that story. Now, those clues that we are going to use are the candles, are the candlesticks. So in this case scenario, we want to be understanding what are the candles doing each time price taps into our zone. So let's go over to the demand zone that we have here. And let's zoom in a little bit. This was actually a trade that I had taken today, actually, but let's go ahead and cover this. So another very similar example to what we covered. Boom, strong move being inputted to the downside. Why didn't that strong move continue, right? Why didn't price continue lower and lower and lower? Because we had our buying level, aka our demand zone, placed here. So once price finally approached and tapped into that demand zone, what did price do? We started to show signs of holding, aka getting that initial rejection, which is what we covered earlier. So that's one good, strong confirmation that we already have, right? Now, what are the candles doing? What are the candles looking like? So boom, we have that hold here, and now we're getting signs of buying pressure. We see a strong green candle here. My green candles are blue, but you guys get the point. But we get a strong candle here showing some buying pressure, right? So this candle right here would be a good confirmation to go long, right? Or to at least get the idea that that demand zone is valid for us to take longs. Obviously, price did close shortly after. Price tapped into this zone, but still, it ended up working out. You can see we got that candle that started to show signs of buying. We did get a slight pullback back into the zone, but this is even, a better confirmation for us, because what did price do once we tapped back into that zone? We didn't continue lower, right? We didn't break that zone. Why is that? Because this buying level, this buying area, then started to show more signs of buying, more signs of rejection. And signs of rejection is pretty much meaning, okay, once price is at that point, these buyers aren't giving up that level, right? Because if that were to be the case, if buyers were to give up that level and sellers were to continue being stronger, price would just continue lower, right? But that was not the case. We started to get signs of rejection, which, as you guys can see right here, I'll zoom in, got signs of rejection within that zone. The candles in price were holding that zone very, very well. And as you can see, market closed, which is the shaded area here, but we still got that nice push up and rejection to the upside off of this demand zone, off of our buying area. Why did we get that rejection? Because, like I said, think of it like a scale, right? When there are more buying orders than selling orders, market obviously moves to the upside, vice versa for selling. And that's exactly what we had here. Market was pretty much just exhausted from all of this selling that we had inputted here. We tapped into our buying zone, aka our demand zone, which is where the buyers were looking to take advantage of, right? Buyers and sellers are constantly being inputted throughout the day, all day, right? But we want to look for areas where those buyers or where those sellers are going to be stepping in the most, going to be inputting the most money, because that's ultimately what's going to move the market the strongest and the most. So that's going to be one of the key things, or another key thing that we want to look for is just overall understanding price action, what the candles are doing inside of our zone. And again, this was a perfect example because price held that zone very well, which is a good confirmation. Price rejected off of that zone very well to the upside, which is another great confirmation. And obviously, price then initially gave us that full confirmation that buyers started to step in, which is another confirmation that our zone was valid. Now, obviously, 2 to 3 confirmations is really all you need in terms of looking for your entry. Really, I'm looking for, just 2 to 3 is perfect for me. If I can get 2 and the zone starts to look valid, I'm taking that entry. I'm taking that trade, right? Especially since our supply and demand zones are offering us very little risk. You can see in this case scenario, if I were to enter right here off of this demand zone rejection and target that high, my stop loss would be a break below that zone, obviously meaning break below that zone wouldn't be valid anymore due to the fact that those sellers were to take over that buying zone, indicating that that buying zone is not valid anymore, is not something that we'd want to look at. So in this case, that still would have been a good trade to me because we got the confirmations we were looking for. We saw that buyers started to step in within that zone instead of just any random area on the charts, and we got that confirmation that obviously the bias was flipping, right? So that's one of the biggest things that you guys want to look for in terms of understanding the confirmations. And of course, it's going to pretty much be it's going to be the exact same thing in terms of when you are trading your supply zones. So let's go over an example of what it would look like when price would break a specific zone and it wouldn't be valid anymore. And it looks like we have a perfect example right here. Now, as we see here, we can see that we are getting a pretty strong push, pretty strong move to the downside. Now, in this case scenario, if this demand zone were to be valid, right, then like we had gone over earlier, we would start to see signs of price holding, of price rejecting within that zone, of signs of buying pressure being indicated within the candles, right? And what that would look like, buying pressure being indicated within the candles, is pretty much exactly, oh, let me just get rid of this here. Exactly, oh, looks like we're all over the place. Exactly this, right? Once we get signs of price holding and signs of those green candles starting to be on pretty much in our demand zones, that's exactly what I mean by that bullish candle pressure right inside of our demand zones, which is one of the confirmations. But here we had never gotten that, right? Price pretty much just continued to fall and break below that demand zone. Obviously, like I said, if price breaks below our demand zone and continues lower, like how it did in this case scenario, it's obviously not a valid demand anymore due to the fact that those sellers took over that zone. Those sellers pretty much claimed their spot and said, okay, the scales, we're still on top in terms of the scale. That's what the seller said. And usually when that is the case, when price does break a specific zone, that zone can then flip, pretty much meaning that since the sellers took over that demand zone, or what we thought was supposed to be the demand zone, that demand then flipped to supply. Because usually our demand zones and supply zones are treated as barriers on the charts, meaning they're typically at least going to show signs of rejection, signs of reversals. And if that isn't the case, that means that the selling pressure or buying pressure was way too strong to push through that zone, to reject off of that zone, which is exactly what we see here. The selling pressure was way too strong for those buyers to be like, okay, it's our turn, right? It's our turn for price to continue to the upside instead of to the downside. So understanding that, it then tells us that pretty much, okay, that demand then flips into some sort of selling area, because that's where obviously we see that sellers are stronger than usual. If price is breaking through a specific key level or a barrier level on the charts, like how we have here, which is pretty much our supply and demand zones, that tells us that, okay, those buyers or those sellers are stepping in heavy. And those are the exact points on the charts that we want to look to take advantage of. And as we can see here, once price broke below this zone, we actually tapped back in that exact zone. And what happened? Boom, rejection back to the downside, obviously indicating that that buying zone that we initially had was then flipped into a selling zone, right? And it would be vice versa if we had a selling zone that were to get broken through to the upside, then obviously that selling zone would then flip into a buying zone. So those are going to be some of the key things that you want to look for in terms of understanding what zone is valid, and in terms of understanding, okay, like what are these buyers or sellers actually going to do. And you can determine what the buyers and sellers are going to do based off of the key things that we had gone over. Understanding what is price action doing, understanding how price is reacting to when we actually reach those zones, understanding is price reversing or rejecting off of our specific zones, showing that opposite side of buying or selling starting to be inputted, right? So those are going to be some of the key things. I'm going to be making a part 2 of this video in terms of understanding how to actually determine the best supply and demand zones and how to actually find the best entries off of supply and demand zones. So stay tuned for part 2, but I hope you guys enjoyed this first part 1, found a couple of things valuable, learned a couple of new things. Like I said, if you guys have any questions, whatever it may be, definitely leave it down below in the comments. I post every single day on my trading Instagram, so I definitely recommend you guys go and follow me over there. I'll put the link in the description. But other than that, go ahead, catch some snipes on the charts, catch some awesome trades, and I'll see you guys in the next video.